Hey everybody, it's Tuesday, it's 3 o'clock. That means it's Tech Tuesday. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the latest stories that are happening in broadband. I'll be right back. Thanks for joining me. I'm Rick Uzzi here at Z-Quorum, and once again I'm going to be talking about some of the latest stories that are happening in the world of broadband. So we'll get to that here in just a second. If you happen to be watching live, or if you join me here in a minute live, feel free to chime in on the chat. I can bring that up on the screen. If you have any comments about some of these stories or anything you want to chat about, feel free to do that on YouTube. So let's see what's happening. First off, let's see. Whoop, this is a big old ad, so let me get rid of that. There we go. Rogers Communications to buy Shaw in a $20 billion deal. So this was a big story. So Rogers and Shaw, two of basically the two biggest cable operators in Canada, are basically planning to merge. Rogers is buying Shaw if this goes through, and they're going to have, similar here in the US, they've got to get through some regulatory hurdles in order to make this happen, which that may present some challenges, but it says the merger will create Canadian telecom powerhouse and spur 5G deployment. And that 5G deployment and some mobile things is where they may run into some hurdles on this. Let's see here. So Rogers Communications said it's agreed to merge with telecom rival Shaw Communications in a $20 billion deal that will bring together the two largest cable operators in the country and create a Canadian wireless powerhouse. Again, that's where there may be an issue. Rogers and Shaw have been mostly friendly competitors over the years, so it's similar to here in the US, I think, where they probably have franchises in different areas, and so they don't really usually compete in the same footprint. Over the years, they've swapped assets occasionally as Rogers concentrated on Ontario and Shaw focused on the western provinces. Shaw has about 5.2 million wireline revenue-generating units, and Rogers about 5.1 million revenue-generating units. So does that mean subscribers? So now we're revenue-generating units. Maybe that's what that means. Their main difference has been on the wireless front. Rogers is the largest Canadian wireless company, so they're already the largest Rogers, with 10.9 million customers, while Shaw is number 4 with 2 million customers as far as wireless goes. Once the transaction is complete, the new Rogers plans to invest 2.5 billion Canadian, I guess about 2 billion in US, in 5G networks across Western Canada. So this is going to spur on additional wireless deployments in Canada through this purchase. While Shaw has managed to hold its own, it added 101,000 wireless customers in its fiscal first quarter, ended November 30th. In April, the company laid off about 1,000 workers, so that was mostly in its retail and sales operations. And its founder, executive chairman, and former CEO J.R. Shaw died in March 2020. So my phone is ringing. I'm going to ignore that. So two companies been successful. Let's see, I don't think I have anything else in here that I want to read. Hold on. It's the second time my phone has rung in 2 weeks. All right, so and then this is interesting here, the same thing. So Shaw shares wow, this is hard to say. Shaw shares soar, try to say that 3 times, on Rogers' deal, but still well below the sale price. As Canadian regulators mull the deal, some questions remain about competition. So again, there's these questions about wireless competition. Shares of Shaw Communications rose more than 40% on the Toronto Stock Exchange in the wake of its $20 billion purchase by Rogers, but the stock price was still well below Rogers' offer, and the offer is pretty high. As questions persist around the deal's potential impact on wireless competition, Rogers agreed to purchase Shaw for $40, $40.50 or $32.40, I guess US, per share, about $16 billion in total cash, a 70% premium to its March 12 close. Both companies own cable TV operations, obviously, but most reports point to possible regulatory concerns on the wireless side of the business. Rogers already is the largest wireless service provider in Canada with about 10.9 million subscribers, as we said. Shaw is the 4th largest, behind BCE and TELUS Communications, with about 2 million wireless customers. So this is, again, so you had basically Rogers as the biggest wireless provider in Canada. And then you had BCE and TELUS, and then you had Shaw. So now Shaw and Rogers combining does present this maybe regulatory challenge for them. The transaction will be examined by at least 3 Canadian government agencies. So this would be similar, I guess, to the FCC and the FTC looking at deals here in the U.S. That would be the Independent Competition Bureau of Canada, the Canadian Radio, Television, Telecommunications Commission, that would be similar to the FCC, and the Department of Innovation, Science, and Economic Development. So they're going to be looking at that. So it's interesting again. So this headline, Shaw shares soar, Shaw shares soar on Rogers deal. That is hard to say. Now here, another headline, a couple days later, Shaw stock slides, or Shaw stock slide. That's hard to say as well. Hints at regulatory uncertainty for Rogers deal. Stock falls 2% Thursday as reports point to possible competitive issues. So the same questions. Shaw stock began to slip March 18th, down nearly 2%, not really much, in midday trading as reports began to mount that the Canadian telecom company's planned merger could get some regulatory pushback. Again, it talks about the deal being reviewed by those agencies. The main issue appears to be the removal of a fourth wireless carrier, a sticking point with Canadian regulators. And then as here in the U.S. again, it's funny how these things are pretty much the same. The politicians get involved. While the regulatory agencies have pledged to scrutinize the deal, some Canadian politicians have expressed doubt about the benefits of the merger. Big telecom companies are gouging Canadians and continue to make massive profits in a time where most families are struggling to get by. A merger between two of Canada's biggest providers will just make it worse. And that was somebody in the New Democratic Party. Didn't highlight it here, but somebody in the more conservative policy said, yeah, we need to look at this really closely. So politics getting involved, again, just as it would here in the U.S. Now, I looked at the stock prices. So this is today. So it looks like it's recovered a little bit today. We've had some recovery, but it's not like it's really dropped that much. If you look 5 days ago, actually you can see the drop here 5 days ago. So this was the stock sliding a little bit, again, recovering a little bit. But if you look at it a month ago, so here you go, you're going along, and then you've got the announcement, and bam, it's way up there. And there's been a little bit of a drop, but not much. And again, if you look at it 6 months, you can see the stock's been pretty flat where it was, and then heading up a little bit, probably as maybe some news got out, and then big rise right there as the news hits. So while they're under what they offered, there's been a big boost, and it's not dropped that much. All right, here's some information about some more broadband stimulus kind of money. In this case, it's the American Rescue Plan. Includes $7.1 billion for an E-rate program that will help. So this is part of the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan bill that President Biden is signing. That includes $7.1 billion for an emergency connectivity fund that would provide additional E-rate funding for emergency connectivity and devices for schools and libraries. I don't know where we're getting all these trillions. We got to be printing it because I know we don't have it. So another $1.9 trillion, and that's a lot of money. This money will support schools and students as well as staff and library patrons. Eligible schools and libraries will be able to use the funds for connectivity and purchase of Wi-Fi hotspots, modems, routers, and connected devices. News stories of students sitting outside fast food restaurants, which were cited by acting FCC Chairwoman Rosenworcel in her statement, where she said, recent estimates suggest that the homework gap, which is what they're calling that now, the homework gap may affect as many as 17 million kids, with recent data suggesting as many as 1 in 3 Black, Latinx, I guess that's Latinx, and American Indian Alaska Native students lack high-speed internet access at home. So, yeah, I mean, that's true. So this money would be going to help that homework gap, which is good. That pain was attested by the FCC Commissioner Jeffrey Starks in a separate press release. A few weeks ago, I met with Detroit middle school students to talk about their online learning experience, Stark said. They told me that a large share of their classmates cannot participate, and many have quit virtual learning out of frustration with slow broadband speeds and inadequate devices. Those students are not alone. An estimated 12 million students remain locked out of the virtual classroom. And that is a problem if they're still out of school. But I can tell you, as a parent, and listen to other parents, that the whole virtual school thing and Zoom school is not good. Even if you have fantastic broadband, it's just not a good experience for the students. So hopefully we can get students back in school. We still need kids to be able to get good broadband at home. There's no doubt about that. But for homework, whatever they're doing. But we don't want to have kids doing school from home for any extended period of time if they can help it. I can tell you again, as a parent, it is not good for the kids to be out of school, both from the learning perspective as well as social things and those kinds of things. So hopefully they'll get that moving along as well. Now this is another huge bill. It's not trillions, but this would be all broadband. Now this is just proposed at this point. House bill would pour $94 billion into broadband expansion. And this would be a group of House Democrats. They introduced a bill entitled Leading Infrastructure for Tomorrow's America Act, or the LYFT America Act. That's not a bad acronym. That would provide almost $94 billion to expand broadband access to underserved communities across the U.S. So, we had CAF2, which was for underserved and really unserved areas. CAF2 was unserved and underserved. Now we've got RDOF, unserved, and then phase 2, underserved for RDOF is coming. So this would be something in addition to that. This is an expansion of the bill's previous version that was introduced in May 2019, which called for $40 billion to be dedicated to broadband deployment and $5 billion for infrastructure. Well, this new one, this latest bill, allocates $80 billion for high-speed broadband nationwide by funding connections to unserved and underserved areas in rural, suburban, and urban areas. So the difference here with something like RDOF, which is the Rural Development Opportunity Fund, sounds like some of this money would go to suburban and urban areas, which is interesting because they don't tend to be unserved or underserved. You're going to find your best broadband in suburban and urban areas. Would also dedicate $5 billion to a new low-interest financing program for broadband infrastructure and $9.3 billion for programs that help make broadband affordable. So I could see that having an impact where maybe broadband's a little bit expensive in some of these areas, and you can help people afford that if they're having trouble with that. Legislation calls for the FCC to distribute $60 billion of the funds through a competitive bidding process. That would be probably similar to CAF2 and RDOF. The rest of the funds would then be allocated to states to use for further broadband deployment. So the money would then go to the states. It also, this is the kicker here, and probably what will kill this. It also prohibits state governments from enforcing laws that prevent local governments, cooperative and public-private partnerships from delivering their own broadband services, such as municipal Wi-Fi. And I would assume that means municipal fiber as well. So I don't know why they're trying to do that. I mean, municipalities tend to do that when there's not good competition or they're not getting good service. And a lot of times, it talks about public and private partnerships. Sometimes that's actually in partnership with an existing provider. So I just don't know if this is going to get traction if they leave that in there, because I think there's a lot of muni broadband out there, and there's a lot of municipalities just in the last year that have been getting into the broadband business because of the fact that we've had such issues with COVID and broadband access and speeds, and especially in certain areas. So, and these would tend to be, this would not be like a major metropolitan area or some area like Chattanooga where they've got fantastic broadband. This would be smaller municipalities where maybe there's not an incumbent that's been in that area that's been doing the job, they think. So. And then here's a story about some more wireless spectrum that's going to be opened up. So the FCC is opening up 3.45 gigahertz band for 5G flexibility. The FCC has voted unanimously on how to open up a swath of high-value mid-band spectrum in the 3.45 gigahertz band, currently used by the DoD for key radar applications. And this would be for commercial wireless broadband, 5G, and separately, they proposed an application for bidding processes for the auction. This will be auction 110 of that 100 megahertz of spectrum. It's seeking comment on those auction processes now. So they voted to allocate this 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz band for flexible use. So this is right under the CBRS band spectrum, which is at about, I guess it's 3.55 to about 3.7 gigahertz, which is just under C-band, and that auction just completed recently. So C-band is like 3.7 to about 4 gigahertz. So this is another swath of mid-band spectrum, again, a little bit lower than those other two, that's currently being used by the Defense Department. And it says for flexible use, they may be talking about, the way it sounds like it's going to be like CBRS, which was a swath of spectrum that the Department of Defense was also using, that they did spectrum sharing. So there's dynamic spectrum sharing there where the Department of Defense uses the spectrum, but there's sharing where if a Navy ship comes in and it tends to want to use a particular swath of that spectrum, then anybody using it has to back off and switch to a different portion of that spectrum. It's all done dynamically within a matter of a few seconds to a minute. So it's probably that, and then also, or the flexible may mean, with CBRS, the way that works is that you have 3 tiers, so you've got the whole swath of that being unlicensed that's available, but then also they were licensing portions of that spectrum as well. And it sounds very similar. It may be that, where there'll be some licensed spectrum as well as unlicensed spectrum sharing that same swath of spectrum. So the FCC is auctioning the 100 megahertz in 10 megahertz spectrum blocks, which was similar, I think the same actually as CBRS. It was either 10 or 20, I can't remember. No, it was 10, I believe. As Commissioner Jeffrey Starks had advocated, with a 40 megahertz limit on how much any one bidder can acquire in a single partial economic area, or PEA. And that is also the same as CBRS was. So you've got these PEAs that are these areas where spectrum is, how they usually allocate spectrum. And so you'd have to acquire, I think you have to bid on the whole PEA, and the most that you can get would be 4 of these 10 megahertz slices, so you can get up to 40 megahertz. But it's a 100 megahertz area, or swath of spectrum, so that's very similar to CBRS. Cable operators had argued that using those larger PEAs would result in less than robust participation in the auction by competitors to the big telecoms, and had asked the FCC to reconsider that proposal. So what they're saying there, I think, is, again, these PEA areas are large, so a cable operator that might be in an area might not want to cover the whole PEA. And it may be because part of their service area is in one PEA and part of it's in another PEA, and they like to get partials, whereas a big telecom is going to want the whole PEA because they're going to be, they're going to have their towers, they're going to want to cover larger swaths of territory. So it may be that. But the way that CBRS was arranging that was that people that bid, if a large telecom bid on a PEA and they didn't want to use it all, or if anybody bid on a PEA and they didn't want to use it all, they could kind of, in a sense, sublease part of that to other operators that wanted to use just a portion of it. So I'm assuming that's what they're going to do with that as well. The FCC will provide a $25 million bidding credit for small businesses and a $10 million credit for rural providers. That's interesting. So if a rural provider wants to get into that, there's a credit available for them, or a small business. 25 million bidding credit for small businesses. It's surprisingly large. Acting Chair Rosamund Worcel said the item has the most aggressive build-out obligations of any 5G spectrum auction, with an infrastructure build-out twice as fast as required in other 5G bands. I'm assuming that means CBRS, because the C-band build-out is pretty slow, because in C-band, instead of having just dynamic spectrum sharing and you've got the DoD use, in C-band you had satellite operators that were using that band, or still using that band, that were beaming programming down through that band, and they're having to exit parts of that band into an upper level and get out of that, so that's taking some time. Congress has set December 2021 deadline for auctioning the 3.45 gigahertz band. The FCC is planning to start this auction in October, so that will be coming up soon. So we'll be hearing more about that. And more on the wireless side. So this story came out, Verizon and T-Mobile get ready to rumble with cable. So they're making this about these larger mobile operators now starting to get maybe entangled with cable in some of their service areas because they've got access to some faster spectrum now. Challenging cable companies on their home turf, both Verizon and T-Mobile used their respective investor events this past week to outline plans to extend their home broadband offerings. So instead of just like a mobile play, they're talking about a home broadband offering where you can be in the house, not just on your mobile phone using it, or using your mobile phone to tether to it or something like that, but actually having a router in the house that will be using the T-Mobile or the Verizon service, their spectrum, to basically to give broadband to your house, so no more need for a wire, so to speak. Verizon kicked things off on Wednesday, saying it will use its newly acquired C-band spectrum to help increase total wireless broadband services nearly 15 million homes by the end of the year. So again, that C-band spectrum, 4.7 to about 5 gigahertz. So it's mid-band spectrum. Before that, however, it's using existing spectrum to offer 5G home in 10 more cities this month, bringing its total 5G home markets to 28. Now, what it's talking about there is their millimeter wave spectrum, which is much, much, much faster. I think that's like, instead of 4 gigahertz. I think it's like 40 gigahertz. So millimeter wave, very fast, but terrible propagation. Won't go through walls, won't go through trees, won't go through, it gets attenuated by moisture in the air. Doesn't go very far, so you need microcells in order to do this. So it's fast, and they're rolling it out in urban areas. The latest to be added: Cleveland, Ohio, Louisville, Kentucky, Omaha, Nebraska, Charlotte, North Carolina, Hartford, Connecticut, Kansas City, Missouri, as well as Cincinnati, Salt Lake City, Las Vegas, and San Diego. And then earlier, they had rolled out Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, Denver, Detroit, Houston, Indianapolis, Los Angeles, Miami, Minneapolis, Phoenix, Sacramento, San Francisco, San Jose, St. Louis, and St. Paul, as well as Arlington, Texas, and Antietam, California. Oh, excuse me, Anaheim, California. That would be Antietam, Virginia, then Anaheim, California. So again, this is talking about millimeter wave here. So when it talks about Atlanta, it's not where I am here in, the north suburbs of Atlanta. It's just would be too expensive to be able to put in all the cell towers that you would need to be able to cover this area. So this is going to be more in areas like downtown, or where you've got high density of population, where you can put up the towers and get lots of customers, where you don't have line of sight issues with hills. You got buildings, but you can put the antennas on buildings or light poles and put them close together. So that's what they're talking about there. It says it will increase the total fixed wireless internet services to 15 million homes by the end of 2021, 30 million by the end of 2023, and 50 million by the end of 2025. So here, I think they're talking about their midband. So it's funny, the story switches back and forth between talking about their midband spectrum and what they're going to do, and their millimeter wave or very high band spectrum that they're using. Let's see, among the advantages that Verizon touts about its 5G home internet: no data limits and no throttling, speeds up to 1 gigabit per second, plans that start at $50 a month, and easy self-setup with no waiting for a cable installer. Again, they switch back to millimeter wave here. So the 1 gigabit per second is millimeter wave. I don't think you're going to get that with their C-band spectrum that they have. So they're switching back and forth. The company reported that 70% of the people doing the self-install on the 5G home product were completely successful and didn't need assistance from a third party. So they're talking about their millimeter wave product. So you got a small cell out there that's within line of sight of your home or business. And then the way they were doing this with homes is, well, you could do it with like you would a satellite dish, where you can put an antenna on the outside of the house that points at the small cell. Or what they were doing, I think later, was they had a pair of antennas, one that was on the outside of a window, another one that was on the inside of the window, and that one on the outside had to have line of sight to that small cell, and then you transfer the signal into the house. So that's needed for millimeter wave, because you can't go through the home with millimeter wave. Meanwhile, T-Mobile is targeting 7 million to 8 million subs in this category within 5 years. T-Mobile is just doing mid-band spectrum. They've got quite a bit of that now with their acquisition of Sprint, and I think they got a lot of, I think both they and Sprint got a lot of spectrum in the CBRS auction that came up, so they've got that mid-band spectrum. While T-Mobile's 5G network is aimed at mobility, it's going to have plenty of capacity to serve millions of consumers in their homes, providing an alternative to cable. As we look at the market dynamics, we believe there's a huge opportunity to disrupt this space, as high-speed options are limited and consumer dissatisfaction with the incumbent cable providers is high. So they're particularly jabbing the cable operators here. It will be targeting rural markets where choices are extremely limited or non-existent for consumers, but it's also looking to serve larger markets. They're going to have a harder time in larger markets because speed-wise, it's not going to be up to the fastest that cable has to offer, or certainly the fastest that fiber has to offer. There are going to be more competitors there. So having one more competitor and having it be mobile, I don't know what that's going to do. In rural areas, it might help if there's not a good incumbent there, but there are some really good independent cable companies and telephone companies that are providing really good service in some rural areas. So they're going to have to pick and choose there. And in places where there's not the best service, there may be fairly soon. So I know you've got some operators out there, let's say, that have large swaths of their, and these are larger operators that have large swaths of their territory. Maybe it's like somebody like Windstream, where it's DSL. But Windstream won a lot of money through RDOF, and they're going to be replacing that out with fiber, using those RDOF funds to help them do that. And there's other people that have RDOF money that are going to be stepping into a new service area or improving the service that they have in their service area. So it's not this, the gap's going to be closing here in some of these areas. So there's going to be more competition and better service. So again, I don't know how well this is going to go over when you're talking about so many years here. T-Mobile has been offering a pilot home internet service primarily using LTE, where it accepted more than 100,000 customers and experienced demand that was far more than that. So again, if this was a pilot program with LTE, we're talking about like 4G quality service and speeds, and it had a lot of success, I have to believe that these are areas where there was really terrible service already. And those areas are shrinking, and it's certainly not going to be, they're not going to be able to go in an area and have that kind of success if there's a good incumbent and more than one incumbent, certainly. Plans to move out of the pilot later this month and expects to serve over 500,000 customers by the end of this year and significantly ramp up in 2022 and 2023, reaching 7 to 8 million customers by 2025. So they're not projecting nearly as high as Verizon is, but so maybe they will have some success if they pick and choose where they're going to go on that. And then a couple of stories here that just kind of follow on with that. So it talks about the Verizon seeing a bigger target market for its 5G home networking. To date, they've deployed fixed wireless using 4G technology and in the millimeter wave band, as we were talking about, that supports high speeds over relatively short distances. That's what I was saying. C-band spectrum should provide greater range at somewhat lower speeds. So it's going to be quite a bit lower than millimeter wave, but a lot further, I think. I think it'll be quite a bit lower. I don't know, what they'll be able to do with that spectrum, but it is quite a bit. The spectrum is quite a bit slower. Verizon executives, this is funny, Verizon executives dodged a question from a financial analyst about what speeds to expect and about pricing plans. Speeds will be competitive, said Verizon CEO Hans Vestberg in response to the question. So again, it depends on the technology. If they're doing millimeter wave, it'll be competitive, but it will be hard to reach lots of people. If they're doing the mid-band, it'll be okay. It won't be bad, but it will be, in a competitive area, it will be just another broadband service and probably slower depending on where they're going. So if it's fiber, if it's DOCSIS 3.1 or 4.0, it's going to be hard to compete as far as speeds go there. T-Mobile, same thing, 5G fixed wireless to launch soon, eyes rural expansion. So we kind of talked about that. Expects to launch broadband offering that the company expects to launch later this month. So I thought this was interesting. They won't require a service contract on the 5G fixed wireless offering, and the offering will not include equipment rentals or fees. They will plug in the router, download an app, and go. So that will help them from the standpoint of in a competitive situation, because if you're tired of your wired provider and maybe they have you locked into a long-term commitment, T-Mobile comes in and you can try them out so you can see if it's any better. And you don't necessarily have to worry about the setup fee, maybe there's a small setup fee, I don't know, but you don't have to worry about equipment rentals, or fees, so maybe you have neither. So you just basically start going and start paying your monthly recurring, and there's no service contract, so you could cancel anytime. So that's good from that perspective of letting people check it out. The bad thing is, if the service is not any better or if there are issues, then the person can drop the service at any time, and you've not made up your investment. So generally, if you're going to bring a customer on, it's going to take you many months to be able to recoup that, especially if you're providing equipment and maybe having somebody come out and help to install it. But just the process of bringing a customer on is expensive. So usually service providers, they figure that it's going to take several months to at least get back to even on that, which is sometimes where there's term commitments. So I didn't know this little fight was going on. Nokia gains troops for the 25G PON fight against 50G PON. So, and the 50G PON is coming from the Chinese side. So Huawei and some of its Chinese customers effectively blocked the standardization of 25G PON, the next-gen technology favored by Finland's Nokia. To the Chinese, 25G PON was a potential threat to the 50G PON technology they preferred. The Finnish response was to march 25G PON outside the ITU and the normal standardization process. So rather than trying to get this standardized through the ITU, they're trying to create a consortium of stakeholders to make this 25G thing happen and to hopefully make it somewhat standard. Nokia set up what it has called the 25GS PON MSA for Multi-Source Agreement Group. The list of founder members included a few impressive names too, comprising AOI, Chorus, Chunghwa Telecom, Ciena, Macom, MaxLinear, NBN Co., Sumitomo Electric Industries, and Tibit Communications. I've heard of MaxLinear, a chip maker, and I've heard of Ciena. Some of these others are not that well known to me. This week it was boosted by the addition of 7 new ones. The standout name is AT&T. That's a big deal. A huge operator whose backing for 25G PON could prove vital. The others identified in the group announcement are CommScope, another big one, Cortina Access, Fennec, Highlight Semiconductor, Hisense, Broadband, and Semtech. Adtran unconvinced. So Adtran's not convinced about this. Not everyone is convinced 25G PON will flourish. Ronan Kelly, Adtran's chief technology officer outside the Americas, reckons 50G PON is likely to prove the most cost-effective choice by the time GPON and XGS PON no longer measure up. So he's saying what we have now is really, for the long term, looking pretty good. He says something he doesn't expect those to be having an issue for another decade. So he thinks by then we really should be up to 50G PON. Today's update does not change his views about 25G PON, partly because the broader industry gave up on non-standard implementations years ago. So that is an issue of trying to go around the standards on these things. And he's saying, we can always back down to 25G if the 25G thing works out, but he's not on board there. Aside from telco interest, a possible industry concern about 25G PON is whether silicon components will be widely available. Seeking to become less independent on big chip suppliers, some of the main equipment vendors, including Nokia, as well as Huawei and ZTE, have also begun developing their own media access controller chips for use on ONTs. One reason was simply financial, but the other reason was to end reliance on Broadcom. So they're trying to, rather than rely on one chip maker like Broadcom, they want to have some flexibility there. So that's something to keep an eye on. We'll see what happens there if other companies join this alliance. This is another thing I was not aware was happening, so I think we'll be hearing about this. Unfortunately, the highlighting on this particular article did not work, but CISA, or CISA maybe, will use new authority over internet service providers to fight ransomware, official says. Acting Director Brandon Wales praised the government's coordination absent a cyber director. So I'm going to read this over here because I don't have anything highlighted. Actually, I can read it. In just about 2 more months, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency plans to activate its newly minted power to force internet service providers to supply the identity of their customers so officials can warn them about vulnerabilities in their systems. It's an important new authority, one that the agency has been pushing for a couple of years, and we're actually getting ready to bring it live, as we finished up some of our procedures and training in the next 60 days or so, she said. So I think this is referring to, I don't think this is going to be for residential customers. It sounds like it's business. So we're not going to be regulating the company. No, see, here it is. I'm sorry. In the last National Defense Authorization Act, Congress gave CISA the authority to subpoena ISPs to hand over the contact information of entities where the agency observes an ongoing opening for exploitation. Gotta get closer to my screen. We're not going to be regulating the company. We want to be able to talk directly to the owner and say, you've got a vulnerable system and it's out on the internet. We found it today, but tomorrow a malicious actor could have found that, exploited it, and your system could have been down or worse. So I guess if it becomes known that there's a vulnerability, they want to be able to contact that particular business, and they can force the ISP to give them through a subpoena, it sounds like, give them that contact information. So again, not aware this was going on, so I guess we'll be hearing about this soon. I don't know if there'll be any other implications for ISPs, or if it's just a matter that they have to respond to this subpoena if it happens. So I guess we'll find out, and I'll certainly bring that up in a future broadcast. Last story. So SpaceX plans Starlink broadband for trucks, ships, and planes. So SpaceX is, they're launching these constellations of satellites, and they're already got lots of customers in beta. Speeds are looking really good. So this is another reason, going back to T-Mobile and Verizon and looking at how they're going to attack these rural areas. Well, this is another thing that's going to make that more difficult for them, is because you've got the satellite play out there that's going to be providing speeds that may be close to what they're going to be able to provide on this mid-band spectrum, because these low Earth orbits can provide fairly high speeds, probably as high as these mid-band wireless spectrums, and they're low latency, so this will be a competitor to that. Dishes will be modified for vehicles, vessels, and aircraft. So originally people were thinking they were talking about doing this in cars, and you could do it in cars, although, and it actually did mention that, I think, in the initial filing, but there was a tweet from Elon Musk that kind of threw water on that. It says, although a SpaceX filing said that Starlink terminals could be deployed on passenger cars, SpaceX CEO Elon Musk indicated on Twitter today that passenger cars are not in the plan. Not connecting Tesla cars to Starlink, as our terminal is much too big. This is for aircraft, ships, large trucks, and RVs, he wrote. So again, probably not cars, at least now, but it may be in the future. It could be like Sirius XM or something like that, where you have satellite connection up to broadband in your car, hopefully for your passengers. I don't know, you're not going to be watching streaming video, hopefully, as you're driving or anything like that, but there may be options for what people can do in the car. The application describes SpaceX's plans for the Earth stations in motion for automobiles, ships, aircrafts. SpaceX says it's seeking authority to deploy and operate these Earth stations throughout the United States and its territories, in territorial waters of the United States, and throughout the international waters worldwide, and on U.S. registered aircraft operating worldwide and non-U.S. registered aircraft operating in U.S. airspace. So that'll be good too for airplanes. When you're on the plane, you'll be able to get broadband, very fast broadband, and low latency broadband through SpaceX. I'm assuming the plane would have to deliver that. Yeah, I don't think you're going to be able to hang out the window and get that. So I'm assuming the plane's going to have some kind of an antenna to receive that. SpaceX told the FCC internet users are no longer willing to forego connectivity while on the move, whether driving a truck across the country, moving a freighter from Europe. That's interesting, right? So ships anywhere they are in the ocean can get this. Cruise ships, freighters, to a U.S. port, or while on a domestic or international flight. So this could mean, for cruise ships, for example, where broadband is just terribly expensive, maybe there'll be a way that they can bring costs down and you can get better service for people. The terminals could be deployed on passenger cars or pleasure boats, SpaceX said in a radiation hazard analysis, that's scary, submitted with this application, although Musk's tweet noted in the update at the top of this article seems to contradict that. ESIM terminals may also be deployed on the masts of ships or on the tops of semi-trucks that are not generally accessible to the public. The devices are compliant and will not result in exposure levels exceeding the applicable radiation hazard limits. That's good to know. I didn't realize there were radiation questions about that. So, all right, so SpaceX, again, very interesting. Should be interesting to see as these months go on and they get more and more customers on, and they eventually, I think this year, will be going to production deployment to see what they do. I think, again, from previous broadcasts I've mentioned, I think their play is going to be in rural areas, these same areas that have got not a lot of competition, maybe DSL, maybe areas that are really hard to reach. So even though there are funds available out there, it's hard to get fiber laid to some of these areas that have just rocky terrain, mountains, whatever else. And again, 5G is not going to work. So they're going to have some opportunities there, and they're looking for other ways that they can basically make a living with the satellite that they're offering here. And one is this, again, ships, planes, doing long haul transfer over the oceans rather than a fiber running across the ocean. So they're going to be doing okay. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. So, all right, thanks for joining me. That's Tech Tuesday for today. I'm going to be back next week, and next week I'm going to talk about the more broadband news, but on the streaming side. So I'm going to talk about IPTV, AVOD, SVOD, and all those wonderful acronyms that go along with IPTV and OTT, over-the-top TV. So I'll be back next week. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you then. Bye-bye.